Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy New Year. Come on in and grab a seat as you're getting your bagel. I almost called it a donut. No donut, sorry. Come grab a seat. Welcome to our first adult education class of the new year. This is a new class, and it's called Christianity's Changing Contours, Global and Local. And here behind me is our professor for the journey. So we're going to be taking this class for the next 4 weeks together for the month of January. And I'm going to let him kind of share more about where that class is headed and give the overview. But I just want to introduce Dr. Richard Young to all of you, his wife here, Allison. You guys may have seen them around. You've been coming for over a year now. A year and a bit. Maybe just a year? Okay. So you've probably seen them in worship. They've gotten plugged into Stephen and Liz's small group on Monday nights. Richard Young is a recently retired professor from Princeton Theological Seminary. Our intern, Matt Green, there in the back row, actually took Dr. Young's last class at Princeton and loved it. So I'm excited to get to experience some of that energy. I just want to tell you a little bit about Richard Young. Originally, you guys are from the West Coast, right? From Washington? From Oregon? Oregon. Is that a faux pas between Washingtonians and Oregonians? Yeah. Like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They have 3 kids. They have lived all over the world. Japan, India, Sri Lanka, Japan. Have many, many interesting stories to share. Richard Young's expertise is in the history of religion. So he was the associate professor. He was the Princeton Theological Seminary Elmer K. and Ethel R. Timby Associate Professor of the History of Religions. Sorry, you said keep it simple. That's not simple. He's interested in the history of the encounter between Christianity and various religions of Asian origin, the place of Christianity in non-Western pluralisms, and contemporary understandings of interreligious dialogue. So he taught courses on the encounter of other religions with Christianity, comparative missiology, and Buddhism and Hinduism. And so over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking a little bit about this emerging field of world religions, and I'm going to let him, world Christianity, and I'm going to let him tell you more about that. Before we get started, let me pray for us. Lord God, I'm grateful for this new year. I'm grateful for a new class here at APC, a chance to learn together, to grow in our understanding of your work in the wider world and how it also impacts us here locally in New Jersey. I'm grateful for you bringing Allison and Richard to our congregation, for their presence, for their participation, for Richard being willing to share his expertise and his passion with us, so that we can be growing in you, as is our mission, our goal here at APC. So would you bless him as he teaches? Would you give us open ears and minds and hearts to learn more about who you are, God? It's in your name, Jesus Christ, that we pray. Amen. And I will pass around the sign-in.
All right, is that better? So it's good to see you here, and for coming out on a dreary morning in January like this. You deserve something that's going to be worth your while, and I hope you feel that way at the end of our time together this morning. Today happens to be Epiphany Sunday. You may remember that Pastor Stephen gave an impromptu sermon on the Magi last Sunday. And Epiphany Sunday, of course, is when the church celebrates the manifestation of the Christ child to the Gentiles, to the Magi. And for the kind of course I've put together, Christianity's Changing Contours, Global and Local, to me, the timing really couldn't be better to start on Epiphany Sunday. But first, a few disclaimers. I'm not a theologian, unlike Dan Migliori, former colleague across the hall at the seminary who was here in the fall, nor am I a Bible scholar, unlike my neighbor at Meadow Lakes, where we live now, Byron Schaefer, who was here during Advent. By training, I'm a rarer bird, and that's an historian of religions. Some of the religions that I've done courses on were named just now. Now, being an historian of religion may not mean a whole lot to you right now, but I mention it because I am doing something different from what Dan and Byron did, and hopefully it will be complementary, I hope not contradictory, to what was done before. Do they have the outline? There is a brief, simple outline of the talk I'm giving this morning, and you can jot notes on that if you wish. So the topic is Christianity's Changing Contours, Global and Local. It's a 4-week series, and what I do today is going to be foundational for the weeks ahead. I'll have to move along briskly. Stop me if you must, if you're lost at what I'm trying to say. It will take me probably 35 minutes to get through it. But next week I'll say much less, speak much less, and the week after that hardly at all. It'll be an open forum. My wife, Allison, is holding a stopwatch, and she's going to give me a 3-minute signal when I'm approaching the end of my time, and I guess I'll have to stop mid-sentence when it's down to 0. So, Maureen Harshman just now in the service said something to this effect to the children, that if you ask questions, you get smarter. And there will be time at the end for some questions, I hope 10 or 15 minutes. I'm not sure that you'll get any answers. Maybe it will be more about what kinds of questions should we be asking, and maybe we'll be able to find out together what some of the potential answers might be. So, news flash. Maybe this isn't new for you, maybe it's old news, but Christianity's center of gravity has shifted rapidly and dramatically from the global north to the global south. That is, from Europe and North America to Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific. So I'll use a kind of wonky nomenclature, which is global north and global south. It's not very helpful, it's very confusing, but it's pretty much the standard nomenclature of the day for a topic like this. So the center of Christianity's gravity has shifted from the global north to the global south. Now, could you put up the first image? What would that shift look like if it were graphed? I wish this were more up to date. It's a bit out of date, but I've never found a better graph to show in a glance what that shift looks like. You might pay attention to the percentages at the bottom over the timeline from 1800 to 2000, because you would see there that the total population of Christians in the global north has been on the decline as the shift to the global south has occurred. So 200 years ago or so, 1800, a very large percentage of the world's Christian population lived here in the global north, but now it's gone down to around 40%. What would it be now? Maybe 60% or so. These percentages going this way tell another story, and that is the story of Christianity's percentage in the world's total population, that is of Christians in the global north and the global south. And there you see not much change. Some, but then there's a plateau, I guess, even a slight decline as we approached this century. And that story is a complex one, and we can talk about it at some point perhaps, but it would tell you that other religions are growing too. And a particularly rapidly growing religion would be Islam. And so in terms of the total world population, Christianity's pretty much holding its own, slightly ahead. It's funny to use this kind of language, but that's the picture graphed. So now maybe to put it a bit more precisely, in 1800, not many years before the sanctuary next door was constructed, a lopsided 87% of the world's Christian population lived in the global north, and only around 13% in the global south. But in the year 2000, a lopsidedness of the opposite kind was becoming apparent. And nowadays, around 60% or so of the world's Christian population lives in the global south. By mid-century, the lopsidedness will increase to around 80%. So just the opposite of how things looked some 200 years ago. So the statistics here are actually different from the ones in the course description, and the more accurate statistics would be these, and so the lopsidedness is even greater, starker than the ones I used in the course description. The trend can't be more clear. Christianity isn't any longer a religion predominantly of the global north. It hasn't been for several decades. And neither the end of the colonial era nor the moratorium on missions, the suspension of missions in the mainline churches, put a stop to Christianity's growth in the global south. It's had its own momentum, and it just keeps going. So, some comments on demographics and religiometrics. I'm giving you here the macro picture, but it does have an empirical basis. Even if on the ground here in Allentown, the micro picture doesn't seem so grim at all. We don't feel the shift in Christianity's gravity moving away. APC is a vibrant church. It's the center of the lives of a thriving community. But of course, that doesn't mean that the overall global trend is invalidated. The shift in Christianity's center of gravity is an objective fact. Image 2, please. So here's the basis for the macro reality. This book and a companion volume, it's a 2-volume set, called the World Christian Encyclopedia. It's come out every 10 years since 1970 from Oxford University Press. And it's just chock-a-block with more statistics than anyone would possibly need on the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's really a massive data collection project, and it's now digital, but for show and tell. I went to the seminary library to get the 2001 edition. And so let me open up the World Christian Encyclopedia to the G's, and I find Guatemala, a place familiar to many in this congregation. And the statistics are really quite fascinating. They give you a picture over a longish period of time, a diachronic picture, so to speak, of Christianity in Guatemala. And it would be no surprise that, say, in 1900, the Christian population in Guatemala was 98%. And it's still, today, around 98%. But what's happened is that instead of that 98% in 1900 being Roman Catholic, around 20% is now Protestant, and then another 12%, perhaps, if I remember correctly, is Pentecostal. So that's a remarkable change occurring in Guatemala. Let's move over to the G's, not the G's, the M's. And what do you think I'm going to find under M for you? Malawi. Yes, Malawi. And let's go to the next image. Oh, that was Guatemala. This is what it looks like online. A little less dense with statistics, but available online, and you would find this for Guatemala. And the next image, please. This is Malawi, and this one I find really, really interesting. If you look at the statistics here horizontally, go down to the first category, Christians, and you see that in 1900 in Malawi, there was a smallish number, and its percentage of the population was only 1.8. But go to 1970, and it's 57.9, and then in the year 2000, nearly 80%. So that kind of change is phenomenal, so very rapid. This is the kind of thing that the World Christian Encyclopedia does a wonderful job of compiling. You can see the lopsidedness country by country, and you can go online. Next one, please. To the World Christian Database, one word, .org, and you get pretty much the same data that I was just using on Guatemala and Malawi. Well, statistics never lie, do they? Well, you'd think maybe from what I've just been talking about that I'm a convert to this kind of quantification project. Some call it religiometrics. I see it as a kind of science, and yet I'm not into statistics really, and I do have concerns about it. I'm not convinced in the first place that Christian is a countable unit. To me, it's a fuzzy category. And I think there is maybe a questionable assumption in the background that skews things, may skew things. And that assumption is that religious identities are always singular. You can only have one. And as an example, you could be a Buddhist but not a Christian too. You could never be both. There could never be a hyphen in between one identity and the other. It's always singular. I'm afraid that that's a flaw in the methodology, and although I haven't lost faith in this kind of approach, it's one that I tip my hat to. I think it's important. It helps us to track what's happening on a macro scale in the world today. But I lived a long time in Asia, Allison and I, and in Japan, for example, where we were for a number of years, if you add up the total population of Buddhists, Confucianists, Shintoists, and others, when you get the total, it's far in excess of the actual Japanese population. And that's because of these multiple affiliations that people have, which are activated depending upon the context. It's a fascinating kind of thing. It's unfamiliar in our way of thinking about religious identity, but I wonder how the statistics would look if that were taken into account. Another misgiving I have about the World Christian Encyclopedia Statistical Project is that it can induce a kind of complacent triumphalism about Christianity's seemingly unstoppable growth. The graph earlier that was on the screen showed, for example, that the total world Christian population, global north, global south, is still just 1/3 of the total, and has been stuck there for a good long time. And as I said, it does mean that other religions, Islam in particular, are growing at around the same rate. What they grow off of is an interesting question, but not right now. So I have some qualms, but those qualms aside, I'm basically on board. I think these are Christianity's changing contours. The margins of the Christian world right now are right here. And even though APC may be at the center of your faith, mine too, let's not kid ourselves, we're on the edges of things. We're on the periphery. Used to be somewhere else, but now it's here. What could be extrapolated from all of this? Well, one is the need for a new historiography. Historiography is how we think of history and write about it, conceptualize it. So a new kind of historiography would be needed. There is a newish field of study which has grown a lot in recent years called world Christianity. Some call it global Christianity. And it is devoted to getting some purchase on the reality of the shift in Christianity's demographic center and grappling with its ramifications for the church today. At the seminary, I used to do a lot in this field, not everything by any means, but I was that was part of my remit in the teaching that I was doing. And it all came about partly as a result of the older models for talking about Christian history or church history were no longer adequate. And the reason for that inadequacy was that we in the field had let our global North mission history dominate the story of Christianity's diffusion in the global South, as if missionaries from the global North were the only actors worth knowing about. Now, we have some in the cemetery out here, and I know their stories. I've heard them, and they're fascinating stories. But what that approach to the history of Christianity's diffusion did was to distract us from the indigenous appropriators of the gospel in the global South. It was much more about what we did for them than what they did for themselves with the gospel that was conveyed to them through the missionary endeavor. So the accent was on, of the older models, was on transmission of the gospel, a missionary endeavor, to the indigenous appropriation of it. And so that has changed a great deal. The pendulum in historiography has shifted from one to the other, and the pendulum is always shifting. And maybe someday, not too far in the future, it will shift back again to the missionary side of the story. But right now, it's more about indigenous appropriation and how that occurred, and especially how non-missionary initiated churches in the global South began to appear and proliferate. So this is another kind of wonky part of the nomenclature. We talk about mission or missionary initiated churches, and we also talk about indigenous initiated churches. And they have very different kinds of stories. So I may, over today and the several weeks of the series, sometimes refer to indigenously initiated churches. So just fill in the blank. It could be, say, Chinese initiated, Mayan initiated, Yoruba initiated, or something else. Next week, I'm going to explain how you can go online to find out more about some of these indigenously initiated churches right here in the greater Allentown area. And then we can share our impressions about them in the open forum that I'm planning for week 3. Now, besides a new historiographical model, a new way of thinking about history and going about writing it, we also need a new, an updated profile of majority world Christians in terms of gender, class, and other kinds of variables. So let me give you briefly a thumbnail sketch of what that new profile might look like in part. People of the global South, women in particular, are today's most representative Christians. Not Europeans, not Americans, perhaps I should say Euro-Americans. Christians of the global South often, but not always, live in poverty or on the brink of it, in regions of the world where public health often, but not always, is abysmal, and governments are often, but not always, dysfunctional. what it is to be a Christian looks quite different, as you can imagine, I think, at 120 degrees in the shade than it does at 70 in temperature-controlled sanctuaries on full stomachs in places where the state can be taken for granted as the guarantor of public safety. In short, much or most of today's world Christian population lives in circumstances similar to the world of antiquity and familiar to Jesus. To exemplify all this, next week I'm going to introduce a once obscure Global South Pentecostal woman from Ghana in West Africa, the composer of a theologically rich epic poem in praise of Jesus Christ. So that will help me and us to put a face on Global South Christianity. A word about immigrants, diasporas, or immigrant diasporas. I'd like to segue back to the global north from the global south to clear up any misconception that to find world Christianity, you have to leave America and go to some exotic destination a world away. If we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, we'll find world Christianity right here in our own communities. A lot of the reason why we find them in our own communities goes back to the Great Society initiatives of the Johnson administration in the mid-60s, when the door opened to immigrants from underrepresented regions of the world. And as you know, around here in Allentown, New Jersey, where once there were only churches and synagogues, now there are gurdwaras, mosques, and temples. You're probably aware, too, of voices in the media that lament this, as though it signals the de-Christianization of America. In fact, most immigrants are Christians already, even when they come from countries where Christianity is a minority religion. Christians often are a disproportionately large percentage of those who emigrate. And that's why social scientists describe what's happening as the de-Europeanization of Christianity and not as the de-Christianization of America. Now, brief aside, I found as I was getting ready to talk to you, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable using language about immigrants because it's so supercharged with dehumanizing rhetoric these days here in the United States. And I was tempted to chuck it all together and substitute a word like diaspora for immigrants. But I've decided to keep it. I want to talk about immigrants. I want to rehumanize the term. Maybe I'll alternate between diaspora and immigrants as a population. The scattered peoples. And there are a number, think of the Jewish diaspora, but any large scale forced migration could be called a diaspora, and there are many. So that's where I stand on that. But that's a kind of macro level picture too that I've just shared. On the ground, it's a lot messier. A recent study by the Pew Foundation found that the percentage of nuns, is that a familiar term? Not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S. Nuns, that is people who don't identify with any particular religion, has skyrocketed. And this is a surprising thing to me, among American-born Latinos and Latinas. It simply can't be taken for granted any longer that being Latino or Latina means being Catholic or even being religious at all. Being Irish, being Italian, used to mean that one was Catholic. Today, Catholics are almost as likely to come from Nigeria or from Vietnam. Christianity's global diffusion and the presence of it in our neighborhoods calls into question any claim by a singular racial, ethnic cohort to ownership over it. Now, for a moment, let me say something about reverse missions. And just in case you weren't aware of it already, I'll break the news gently. For many Christians of the global south, the global north, here where we are, is now their mission field. And why not? Missions, to go theological for a moment, should be multi-directional, wouldn't you think, from everywhere to everywhere. The Great Commission wasn't only meant for Europeans or Americans, it was for everyone. So could you put the next image on the screen, please? Yeah. So on the screen you see a New York Times article from several years ago, and this is the pastor of a church in Brooklyn, I think, Bronx, of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, RCCG they call it for short, and this is an evangelistically ambitious church of West African origin, determined to reconvert America. It believes that we need it, and we've strayed from the gospel. We don't read our Bibles, or if we do, we don't read them the way they should be read. We read them historically and critically, and sort of in a distantiated way. And for many Christians in the global south, that just doesn't seem right. And so having us as their mission field is a powerful driving force. I remember several years ago, well, whenever I say several, it's probably more likely 10, 15, or 20 years ago. At the seminary, there was a small group of RCCG students from Nigeria. They were visiting, and I thought I'd take them to the presbytery meeting. And on the agenda that night was a very, very difficult topic. And that was whether an historic church, small church, but an historic church over on the Delaware River, which was dying, should be kept going or just closed down. And I remember in the car on the way home, these young seminarians, they were appalled at how that presbytery meeting was conducted. They said, "Give us that church. We'll turn it around." Well, actually, RCCG hasn't been that successful so far. It's not mainstreaming. It's not finding mainstreaming in America that easy. But the West African diaspora population is substantial, and that's where it grows, and hopes to put a church on every street corner by a certain time, maybe around 2050. Yes?
Talking about, I've been wondering, because in thinking about people from the South coming up here to evangelize, it feels like at least for the mainstream church, is that what you call it, mainstream? The
Mainline.
Mainline.
Yeah.
It might not be very effective because their beliefs are so different.
Yeah.
Beliefs in witchcraft and
Right.
But it's also caused me to think about, I wonder how effective our early missionaries were compared to the indigenous missionaries growing churches. That to see even a picture like this,
Yeah.
we wouldn't feel very comfortable with that happening in our church.
Even though we read a passage from Mark
Yeah,
about Jesus casting out a demon
yeah,
that had taken possession of a young boy, threw him into the fire, and of course the text doesn't say, well, it was really epilepsy, but anyway, Jesus pandered to this misconception and healed him anyway. I would really love to know how that text is read by Global South Christians. It would be, I'll hazard this guess, that many would say that it is epilepsy, but it's also something more. Epilepsy is only a part of the diagnosis, but there's something spiritual also that accounts for it. So it's not that these people aren't comfortable thinking in terms of the causation of illness in modern scientific medical terms. It's that there's that plus something. And I was thinking about how so many of the Global South immigrants from West Africa in particular are people in the medical profession. Nurses with skills that are very much in demand in this country. And how it's possible to think about Scripture and the stories of healings in these two different ways at the same time without conflict. But you're right, of course, and there is a mission history which would be fascinating to go into. I know very little about Africa, actually, in my specialization, such as it would be in Asia. But interesting thing, in a nutshell, is that in West Africa, parts of West Africa, the missionaries were German Reformed. And they came from Switzerland and Germany under a mission society called the Basel Mission Society. You think of Basel as being in Switzerland, but it's adjacent to a huge German-speaking area. And they arrived in the mid-19th century, and they were the most interesting people. They believed in kind of pluralistic medicines, and there were folk healers back in Switzerland and Germany, and apparently in the very early years, the Basel missionaries would say when someone came to complain about a mysterious ailment that seemed to have no obvious medical cause, they would say, well, go to the healer, go to the healer of the pre-Christian African religion. So there was this sense of you don't have to just go with modern science such as it was in the early 19th century. You can go to the healers. They know something about healing too. I guess what I'm saying is that the mission history is kind of complex. But as time progresses, even the Basel missionaries begin to think, well, we better start medical evangelism. We need doctors, we need clinics, hospitals, and things like that. So there's gradually a sidelining of those older ways of thinking about illness and about healing, until eventually there was no place for it at all. Allison, I'm really out of time, I guess.
Not really.
And then we have to jump into the middle of the 20th century when Pentecostalism arrives, and the old mission-initiated churches just wither almost to the vanishing point until they go charismatic. And they do, and that means that you have Presbyterians and others who engage in healing, not through medicine, but through other means, including even exorcism.
I don't know what Pentecostal means.
Well, let me narrow it down to speaking in tongues. So charismatic would be a category of Christian that emphasizes the Spirit and its healing powers, but not tongues as such. Pentecostal would be charismatic plus tongues. A lot of what? Yes. Do you recall from the book of Acts the day of Pentecost and the speaking of tongues that occurred? People hearing their own languages and others in a mysterious kind of way, and the tongues of fire that were observed over the heads of those who were. So it has a foundation in the book of Acts, the early part. Okay, so thank you. I'm going to go back. Anne?
No, I'm just curious. You made the distinction between Christians and Pentecostals, and maybe this is not the road we want to go down today, but following up on Julie's question about Pentecostals, I just wonder, when we think about the global changing, is there something, how, whether or not Pentecostals are not steeped in the belief in Christ?
Well, I wouldn't want to create a category Christian that excludes Pentecostals. If I said something like that, I certainly didn't mean it. Okay, yeah. But the differences within us are often very, very deep. And it only gets deeper the farther out into the world you go. But the world is a small place nowadays, and those Christianities, I'll use the plural, are here, of course, too. And, the circuitous routes by which Pentecostalism arrives in West Africa, they're fascinating. Philadelphia would be the point of origin. for Pentecostalism in West Africa, a good portion of it. But that's another story for another day. So there is a lot that is recognizably Calvinistic about Ghanaian Presbyterians. I think a few moments ago I was moving in that direction, Ghanaian Presbyterians, as an example of mission-initiated Global South Christianity. Ghanaian Presbyterians are recognizably Presbyterian in a number of ways, especially their polity. There would be no difference. I wonder if I have. Okay, so I got ahead of myself. I need to back up for a moment. About mission-initiated churches in the Global South and kind of zeroing in on Presbyterians. There are many more Presbyterians abroad than there are here in the Global North. As a denomination, we PCUSA Presbyterians remain overwhelmingly Euro-American, but that's not the whole story nowadays. Korean Presbyterians are, of course, the most numerous cohort, but I do want to single out Ghanaian Presbyterians for a special comment. A sizable portion, a sizable cohort in the West African diaspora is the Ghanaian, and the Ghanaian Presbyterians here in America remain independent for the most part of the PCUSA, and they govern themselves under the jurisdiction of the denomination back home. An anthropologist down at the University of Pennsylvania, Adam Moore, could you put the next slide up? I think that's the right one, yep. Did this book, Enchanted Calvinism. That's a church in Ghana, Presbyterian. And the title, Enchanted Calvinism, I think ought to raise an eyebrow. Enchanted is not the image Calvinism usually conjures up. Enchantment and its opposite, disenchantment, are actually technical sociological terms, and I have to explain them a bit. And to clear one misconception up right away, enchantment has nothing to do with Disney, with Tinkerbell, or with pixie dust. Now, next image, please. From the time of Max Weber, a German sociologist, disenchantment has been used to talk about the kind of world most or all of us live in who are right here in Schulte Hall right now. That is to say, apart from ourselves, there are no other spiritual beings in the world around us except the sovereign God. The world we inhabit has been stripped of all other spiritual beings, whether benign, like angels, we heard a lot about them during Advent, or malign, like demons. This stripping away of the supernatural is the meaning of disenchantment. In Calvin's Geneva back in the 16th century, it was a place where demons lurked, magic was practiced, and exorcisms occurred. But the seeds of disenchantment were sown in that era of the Reformation with its insistence on the absolute sovereignty of God. Now, you may know of Max Weber from hearing or reading his well-known work called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And it is a reflection on the disenchantment, and the term which I've appropriated from him comes from there. So back to the Ghanaians, they're recognizably Calvinistic in a number of ways, especially their polity. Maybe they're better Calvinists than we are. And, you know, Calvin has something to do with the genealogy of the faith tradition that we're all a part of here. Maybe they're better Calvinists. The world they inhabit, whether in Ghana or America, continues to be a world of enchantment, of powers and principalities, of malign and benign spirits. Next image, please. This is an announcement for a deliverance service, healings and exorcisms, down in one of the nearest Ghanaian churches affiliated with the APC USA in a suburb of Philadelphia. And they do this on a very regular basis. Someone called the catechist Aboa Ofe comes over from Ghana and tours around the different churches, and healings and deliverance occurs. When I say deliverance, of course, I mean a number of things, but loosely speaking, exorcisms. I brought them to the seminary once. Aboa Ofe, lovely man. I wanted to exorcise some of my colleagues on the faculty, and got to know him a lot, and really admired him, and got somewhat familiar with the kinds of cases that are called possession by Ghanaians. But I guess in the interest of time, I'm going to have to say that the streets of the United States are pretty mean if you're an immigrant. And there's some really mean spirits out there. And some follow from Ghana to America. Others that are encountered here for the first time. That's how people would speak of their experiences. Healing, exorcism, that's an important part of pastoral care in such communities. This is enchanted Calvinism. And it's similar in many respects to Calvinism in Calvin's Geneva. It's certainly a lot like the world of Jesus in the first century, even though it may have very little in common with ours in Allentown in the 21st. Now, right, my wife is looking at me like, you better close this down, and I will, with a few comments about something theological, which I'm not good at all at doing, but this is sort of how I think of what I've been talking about today in theological terms when I go that way. In my study of religion, I think my task, my responsibility is to describe, explain, and interpret. As a non-theologian, I don't judge what I describe, explain, and interpret. As a person of faith, of course, I wonder what's the deeper significance of Christianity's changing contours. The diversity can be bewildering, it can befuddle. Sometimes it seems extreme enough that Christianity can't really be spoken of any longer as a singular thing, and maybe we need to speak of it in the plural of Christianities. But now, just to wrap it up, let me suggest a way of finding coherence in Christianity's kaleidoscopic diversity. I learned this from a pioneer in the field of world Christianity. Next slide, please. a Scottish historian who was my colleague at the seminary when I was new. This is a man by the name of Andrew Walls. He's passed on a couple of years ago. Walls had a penchant for the prologue of John's Gospel. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It follows, Walls believed, that Christian diversity is the necessary product of the incarnation. For him, diversity was something to celebrate, not for its own sake, but rather, in the language of Paul in Colossians, for the sake of the fullness of God, for comprehending the fullness of God, the mystery of Christ. If that fullness could be understood from only one cultural point of view, it wouldn't be very full, now would it? So that was Walls's point and mine, and that's all for today. Next week we'll dive back in. I hope you liked the art from Bali in Indonesia. I'll show you a few more pieces next week. Thank you, everyone. I see that I've gone too long. And if you haven't been to the 8:30 service, you better get over to the 11. Did I spill something? Oh,